The Paris attacks give world leaders renewed motivation to end the war in Syria. France's president says the attacks are an act of war planned abroad. But what's the best way to prevent further atrocities, and does the answer lie in Europe or in the Middle East? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme in Doha. I'm Adrian Finighan. France is a country at war. That was the view of President Francois Hollande in the immediate aftermath of the Paris attacks on Friday, a warning reiterated by his Prime Minister Manuel Valls. Take a listen.
Face au terrorisme.
We've known for months that we're at war, that terrorism will hit France, and it hit even though we've prevented many attacks. All intelligence services are on alert. We know that operations were being prepared and are still being prepared, not only against France, but other European countries as well.
Well, those comments raise important questions about what France and Europe should do next. If France is at war, is it at war with the ideas driving these kind of attacks or with the people carrying them out? Should that war focus on what's happening in France or in the Middle East? Overnight, French police carried out almost 170 raids nationwide, searching for suspects linked to Friday's bloodshed. The attacks are focusing attention on efforts to stop so-called radicalization in the Muslim community. Around half of the 3,000-plus Europeans who've traveled to fight in Syria left from France. Well, just 500 kilometers from Syria, world leaders have been in Turkey for a G20 summit of economic powers. The message from Antalya is eliminate ISIL and you prevent more attacks. There's mounting pressure on Russia's President Vladimir Putin to target ISIL. US President Barack Obama and his Russian counterpart have agreed on the need for a political transition led and owned by Syria. Still, there are sharp differences over the future of Syria's President Bashar al-Assad, differences which are dampening hopes for a breakthrough at that G20 summit. Lots to discuss on today's Inside Story. Then let's bring in our guests. From Paris, we're joined by Bruno Tertrais, Senior Research Fellow at the Foundation for Strategic Research. Bruno is also a former policy advisor to the French Ministry of Defense. From Vienna, we're joined by Robert Wesley, President of the Terrorism Research Initiative. And from London, Eugenio Lilly, founder and chairperson of US Foreign Policy Research at King's College London. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Bruno, if we start with you first. If France is at war, what's it at war with? An ideology or the people who planned and carried out these attacks?
Both, clearly, because it has two meanings. The use of the word war in the mouth of the Prime Minister and the President has two different meanings. There is war in the literal sense of the term, and that means a military fight, or a fight that involves coercion, police and the military, primarily against ISIL in Syria and Iraq. And there is a second component at war, which is the metaphorical, the symbolic one. Just like you say, you can be at war against drugs or cancer. You're saying you're at war against terrorism. That is, you need to fight ideology. But of course, you don't fight radicalization and an ideology by military means. So this is a different kind of war. But I think from the French perspective, it's really two different kinds of war that are under this expression, we are at war.
Robert Wesley, in Vienna, if you eliminate ISIL in its heartland, in Iraq and Syria, do you prevent further attacks on European soil? Is it as simple as that?
No, indeed, it is not as simple. In fact, I think eliminating ISIS in Syria and Iraq in itself is an incredibly challenging prospect. Even if you had wide political agreement, even if the individuals that are negotiating in Vienna, in the G20s, come to an understanding of a common approach, I don't think you're still going to be able to eliminate ISIS. And in fact, by doing so, by increasing the intensity of the conflict, you may also exacerbate the threat to Europe, as reprisal attacks would be on the agenda of ISIS in that case.
Eugenio, in London, the war on terror was declared back in 2001. What, if anything, has it achieved?
I would like to point out one thing first. We're making a big mistake here in framing the entire discourse in terms of war. We have seen the results of the war on terror, right? We have seen the coalition of governments fighting against this extremist threat, framing the discourse in terms of war. This is what extremist organizations want, because they put these governments in a position of reacting to their actions and to sharing their narrative, therefore reinforcing their narrative and their effectiveness in recruiting people on their behalf to carry out these kind of attacks. My point is that if we keep focusing on the concept of war or the discourse of war, we will limit our options in terms of how to find a solution to the problem. We will look at this as only military tools are the good tools that we can use to find a solution. This is a big, big mistake, because we will find ourselves in fighting a sort of whack-a-mole war, where before you're fighting against Al-Qaeda, then you're fighting against ISIL. Then once you defeat ISIL, there will be the exact same organization with a different name using the same exact argument to recruit people. So I think we should start broadening our view, change the discourse. Once we change the discourse into one that is different from war, we might think to find a solution to the problem.
Bruno, what do you make of that?
I'm not sure I really understand. If it's not a war, what is it? A show, a ceremony, a dance, a musical play? I mean, let's get serious. Again, it's not about a military fight only. I've made that clear, and I think the French authorities have also made that clear. It's not even primarily about a military war. It is primarily a war of ideas, a fight of ideas, if one doesn't want to use the term war. But I think it's only by using the term war that you can mobilize the strength of a society to fight against it. And frankly, this idea that it's only whack-a-mole, that once you defeat Al-Qaeda, or at least that you reduce it to a manageable threat, there is necessarily something else that emerges, is a completely misguided view of the history of the past 15 years. There was absolutely nothing inevitable about the rise of ISIS.
Eugenia, do you want to come back on that?
Oh, sure. I mean, I take this really seriously, because there are people dying, and I try to find solutions that actually solve the problem and not make it worse. I do agree that this is not like the military solution is not the solution, is not the entire solution. But my point, and I'm really sorry if the other guests didn't really get it, but is that you have to look at the causes of these grievances and arguments used by extremist organizations, whatever their name is, in order to recruit people. And I'm also worried about what is happening at the G20, because we are focusing on increasing airstrikes. I would like to hear more about how to find a political solution to Syria, and we heard something coming from there. How to solve the political crisis in Iraq, because that's what is driving many Sunni to support ISIS, not because they like the ideology, but because they don't see the Iraqi government as a representative one. And I don't see a lot of talk and commitment by governments fighting Islamic extremism in resolving the refugee crisis, in solving the crisis in Yemen, in solving the crisis in Libya. It seems like those political problems are simply not considered, because we look at it as a war, and therefore we are only focusing on airstrikes against Raqqa. That's not going to work.
Robert Wesley, in Vienna, what do you make of what you've heard there? Should there be a more global effort to counter not just the ideology behind the attacks, but the political situation, something that doesn't involve military action?
I mean, I think it's fallacious to sort of frame the approach in terms of war, or whether or not we're at war, or whether or not we need to be doing more sort of localized activities like the previous guest mentioned. I think Europe especially is engaged in a lot of de-radicalization programs, counter-radicalization programs. We understand that that necessitates a comprehensive approach, but the question is, do we have a comprehensive approach in Europe or anywhere else internationally? And I would say that we don't have a comprehensive approach. We don't have a comprehensive approach to diplomatic discussions with Iran. We don't have a comprehensive approach as to the intensification of operations in Iraq and Syria. What are the objectives? What are the goals? How to hybridize that intervention in terms of whether inserting ground troops, whether maintaining air superiority. What does that actually look like? We don't have a common approach there. We don't have a comprehensive or common approach to refugee integration. This is a huge elephant in the room. What are we going to do with the tens of thousands of refugees that are entering? How are they integrated into our societies? And how do we prevent those communities from becoming a recruitment ground for extremists in the future? Why do we not have a functional, effective, EU-wide counterterrorism organization? Why do we not have effective public dialogue in order to counter extremism, either on the right or on the other side as well, the jihadist side?
Okay,
These are questions that I think that we need to be asking our leaders at this time.
You raise a lot of very interesting questions there, Robert. Let's put some of them to Bruno, starting with this anti-immigration sentiment that is set to grow following an attack such as Friday's. How do you ensure that immigrants are properly integrated into European societies? And that's something that France in particular has had a problem with, isn't it?
Indeed. Let me come back to that in just 1 minute, but I'd like to react to what has been previously said. I think when you say we should have a comprehensive approach and we say we should have a common approach, these are two different things. I would argue that there has been a lot of soul-searching and of efforts as finding comprehensive approaches in France, in Europe, and within the US-led coalition. This is not only and not even primarily a military fight, let me restate it for the record. The problem is about the common approach, and I would say that one of the key reasons why the fight against the so-called Islamic State has been so inefficient, or at least not sufficient enough, not fast enough, is that there is no really a common approach between France, the United States, Turkey, Iran, Russia in particular. As long as we don't have that common approach between all the parties, the main parties concerned, we won't be able to reduce significantly, to degrade the capabilities of the so-called Islamic State.
Bruno,
on your question, it's
Bruno,
absolutely
hang on,
true.
Bruno,
Let me emphasize one thing.
Before you get to my question, just tell me what that common approach would look like.
Well, it's a very simple question. A question that should be asked to every participating country in the G20, as well as Iran and others, perhaps. What is the number one priority? Is your number one priority in terms of security policy in the Middle East defeating ISIS or not? It's a question where I know Tehran and Moscow don't agree on that. Their first priority is support the Bashar al-Assad regime. And as long as you have that major difference between Russia, Iran, and to some extent other countries, and the rest of the world, then the common approach we are talking about is not going to be possible. And as long as you have a Turkish government which failed to enforce its border controls and allows trafficking by ISIS, filling the coffers of ISIS, then we won't have the common approach, even less a comprehensive approach. On your question, what you're saying is absolutely true. It's a major problem for France. We have identified it already 30 years ago, and successive governments have failed over and over and over. But it's not only about migrants, it's not only about foreigners, it's also, and perhaps mostly, first and foremost, about French persons. The integration, the fact that communities are able to live together with a single view of what our nation should be, that starts at home with Frenchmen and French women. That's our first problem. It is also a problem with the migrants, but in a sense it's a deeper and graver problem that France has to face. I am afraid that what happened over the weekend will make our debate on migrations even less healthy, and that unfortunately we are going to shut down the migration flows for bad reasons, so to say. But I think it's almost unescapable that throughout Europe you're going to have repercussions of the Paris event on the migration debate.
Okay,
I hope it will be a cool-headed debate.
I know Eugenia wants to come back and comment on that, but first let's hear what Robert has to say there. I mean, apart from France at the moment, it seems that no other state is treating ISIL as the greatest strategic threat to the world today. As Bruno was saying there, Russia at the moment seems more concerned with targeting anti-Assad forces. Turkey perhaps looking at the PKK as its main enemy. Saudi Arabia more concerned about Iran at the moment. And after the mess of Iraq, Americans are in no hurry to send ground troops back to the region.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can actually take such a myopic approach that Iraq or Syria is the most important issue that deserves all the concentration. If you look at France's interest in their involvement, they have a lot of interventions going on in Africa, support missions there. There's a lot of interest involved aside from Syria and Iraq. Is this their greatest threat coming from them? I think so, definitely. In terms of a question I would throw back to our French guest is, there's been a lot of talk about information sharing and information exchange, and the French services have made large steps in the process of tearing down some of their internal organizational barriers to information exchange. I would wonder, do those still exist? Do we still have cases where information is not being shared, and why is that the case internally? And if we cannot fix that in France, how can we fix that on a European-wide basis?
Bruno?
No, I'm happy to answer that question. I would say that this is certainly not the most pressing concern when you try to gauge whether the French security apparatus has been efficient or not so far. The situation is much better, for instance, than it was, say, in the United States in 2001 before September 11. It's actually much, much better. Our problem is not that. Our problem is that we don't have the human resources which are necessary to follow and monitor all suspected people who are suspected of radicalization and people who may be on the verge of being interested in committing terrorist attacks. That's our main problem. It's much more a human resources problem than a problem of stovepiping and information sharing within the country. I would certainly agree, though, that this is not yet satisfying at the European level. And even though it works very well on the bilateral level between a country like France and the United States, it works fairly well. It works fairly well also between France and the UK to a large extent. It does not work everywhere like that in Europe. But that's also, as the other guest certainly knows, because intelligence is such a precious national resource that every country in the world is actually very careful about sharing it, and that's something that is hard to change. All
right, I want to bring Eugenio back into the discussion here. Eugenio, I was talking about France appearing to be the only state at the moment that treats ISIL as the greatest strategic threat to the world today. To what extent has that threat been overblown? To what extent has ISIL hit its limits?
Well, I agree with the other guests when they say that it's too simplistic to say that ISIL is the greatest threat in the world right now. There are so many other big problems. The thing is, especially in Europe and especially in France right now, the people have been directly affected. So it's not only the news. People on the street saw what happened and they felt it so close to their homes that now they are feeling this threat as bigger than the others. But this is clearly not the case. And again, I would like to make a difference between ISIS as a threat in Syria and Iraq that can be contained, militarily speaking, can be contained to those areas. And ISIS as a threat, ideological threat, a distinction that has been made throughout the debate here, that is more difficult to contain because these ideas spread. And as long as we don't resolve some of the problems, some of the problems that feed this narrative of hatred, of war that comes from the region, again, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, you name it, we will not be able to contain and degrade, and as President Obama said, ultimately destroy ISIS as an idea. So we should work on two different levels here. And one is let's say, relatively more easy to solve, the military one, and the other is less easy to solve and it will take more time. And I don't see the same commitment in finding political solutions to this crisis than I see commitment in terms of increasing airstrikes.
And talking of political commitments, Robert, of course, none of these attacks can happen without funding and expertise. How Do you cut off the flow of money and resources that are going to these people, the kind of people who would mount the sort of attack that we saw on Friday? How do you hold to account the people, or perhaps even nations, that are funding groups like the ones that carried out Friday's attacks?
Well, I mean, on the first point, we don't know who actually carried out these attacks aside from what's been released so far. We don't know what states may have supported this or not. I don't really see an immediate state connection. We are doing a lot of work, we as the international community and individual nation states, in limiting the financial resources of ISIS and other such groups there. How do you cut off the funding to the individuals actually perpetrating the events in Europe? That's an open question. It's going to depend upon when the individuals entered in Europe, what resources they needed. Here we have an event where we have Kalashnikov rifles. These are available, not readily available, but they are available. If you look at the composition of ISIS and you look at the individuals and where they came from, what countries they came from, you can actually make a crescent from Syria and Iraq all the way to Paris and beyond with individuals that make up these ISIS. And so the networks that they can build from those connections make it very difficult for intelligence agencies, security agencies to penetrate or to become knowledgeable of them. Some of these you can obtain information if you have sources within some various criminal networks that might have eyes on these situations. But in terms of the actual attack funding, I don't see what you can actually do for that.
Okay. Bruno, is that something you'd agree with?
Yes and no. First of all, for the record, I did not say, and I don't think the French government believes, that ISIL is the #1 strategic threat in the world. I do agree that there are many other strategic threats in the world. The point is about whether or not in the Middle East today, the first priority should be to defeat ISIS, or are there other priorities, okay? Second, on how to degrade the resources of ISIS, which we all agree, I think, that it's a central issue. It's much more difficult than for a state-based aggression and organization, because ISIL does not use the traditional bank system. But there are ways to degrade their funding. First of all, cut off their possibility to sell oil and gas on the market, and this involves, once again, the cooperation of Turkey. Turkey is letting its citizens and middlemen sell the oil and gas that is being pumped and used by ourselves. Again, that's a very clear point, a very clear strategy, a very clear suggestion. Second, the other resources from ISIL, there have been tens of excellent studies done on this, come from trafficking, hostage taking, human trafficking, and all kinds of traffic. Now, this is much more difficult because you have to do it on the ground. But that's the way you can reduce and ultimately degrade ISIS' financial ability to sponsor the kind of attacks that happened in Paris last Sunday. But one last point, unfortunately, even with less resources, ISIS would still be able to actually organize or sponsor Paris-like attacks, because unfortunately they are fairly cheap.
Eugenie, is that something you'd agree with?
Oh yes, I agree that there is a possibility to reduce the likelihood of these attacks to occur, but the possibility to stop them outright, that's really hard. And even when you talk about financing, the fact that you can have the lone wolf attack, someone that wakes up in the morning and for some reason buys into this narrative of war against Islam, and Western countries wake up in the morning and decides to go to a supermarket and kill the people there. How do you stop that? So it's a really difficult question, and as the other guest said, is an open question we have to work on.
So this, in effect, is Europe's new reality?
Unfortunately, I believe that if we keep focusing on the military aspect of this conflict, then it will be the new reality, yes.
Okay. Gentlemen, there, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. We're out of time. Many thanks indeed for being with us in Paris. Bruno Tertrais, In Vienna, Robert Wesley, and in London, Eugenio Lilly. And thank you, as always, for watching. You can leave your comments on our discussion here at our programme page on the website aljazeera.com, and you can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or, of course, you could tweet us at AJ Inside Story. Thanks for watching from me, Adrian Finighan, and the rest of the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.